Well, hello. My name is Father Chris, and I am the priest in charge at St. Dunstan's Episcopal Church here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I received an email this morning that I thought about responding to, but I thought, no, you know what? I think I would rather have a discussion about the question that I was asked in this email, put it out there and share it with the community. So this is what this email said. I have been going to church for a majority of my life, and I have never seen where in any, and I mean any translation of the Bible, where same-sex is accepted. Nowhere in the Bible have I ever seen that this was okay. So I wanted to just take an opportunity to bring up this issue, what the Bible says or doesn't say about same-sex relationships or same-sex orientation or same-sex identity. Um, the first thing I think we need to point out is that the Bible has no concept of sexual orientation or sexual identity. That doesn't exist in the Bible. So what we're really doing when we look at the Bible is we're asking the question, what does the Bible say, or how does the Bible attempt to regulate sexual behavior? So if someone says to you that their identity or their orientation is somehow condemned in the Bible, that is patently on its surface false, because the Bible doesn't talk about orientation or identity. It has nothing to say on that subject. So again, the real question that I think we can ask of the Bible is, how does it try to regulate sexual behavior? Now, when you go through the Bible and you look at all the passages that deal with sexual behavior, there's very, very few that touch on the subject of same-sex sexual behavior. There's almost nothing in the Bible about it. Jesus himself famously does not talk about it at all. There's nothing in the Gospels in which Jesus is quoted as saying anything at all with regards to those kinds of sexual behaviors. So Jesus did not weigh in on this. There are some passages in the Old Testament that touch on it, but these passages almost always are contained within a context that makes the interpretation of those passages very specific. So, as an example, Deuteronomy is a book that is very interested in things like purity or holiness. So if you are to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, there is a way that you prepare for that, and there is a holiness code or a purity code that dictates how those kinds of preparations can take place. There's dietary restrictions, there's behavioral restrictions, there's all kinds of different ways in which those codes say this is how you prepare for worship. And the passages that are usually referenced as condemning same-sex sexual behavior are within those holiness codes or within those purity codes. Other things that are in there, you may have heard this before, are things like dietary restrictions, or things like other kinds of behavioral restrictions that occur in there. And so when someone says that when they point to those holiness codes or when they point to those purity codes and say, well, that's why we can say that same-sex sexual behavior is condemned, the question really becomes is, okay, well, if you're going to condemn that, what about all the other stuff that those purity codes touch on? Are you eating shellfish? Have you gotten a tattoo? Those are also things that are banned in the purity codes. So are you going to pick and choose which parts of the code that you want to enforce and which parts of the code you want to let go of? How are you going to make that determination? What is the theological way that you can make a coherent argument about including some but excluding some as you conduct your life in the modern world? Scholars that I have talked to, including the scholars of my seminary, were uniform in their rejection of being able to point to some and say those are still appropriate, and point to others and say, no, we can safely let those go. Their recommendation was the entire holiness and purity code belonged to a different time and a different age, and we shouldn't use those as ways of judging same-sex sexual behavior in this time and in this age. So that kind of touches on the Old Testament and some of the things it says about it. Now let's go to the New Testament. I've already mentioned that Jesus doesn't talk about this at all. So Jesus is not condemning same-sex sexual behavior in any of his teachings or the way he conducted his ministry in his life. The Apostle Paul did touch on this, but again, context matters. What is Paul trying to say, or how is Paul trying to address these issues that he writes about to some of the churches. What are the things he's trying to talk to people about? Well, one of the things that Paul is very concerned about is idolatry, making idols out of something that then become more important to you than your relationship with God. So food can be an idol. Wealth can definitely be an idol. Alcohol can be an idol. Ways that we engage in our lifestyles can all potentially become idolatrous. And so when Paul lists out a whole bunch of things that he wants people to avoid, he's largely thinking about it in terms of things that can get between you and God, things that can interfere with your relationship with God. So the things in and of themselves aren't necessarily evil or to be condemned in and of themselves. It's the way that they express themselves in people's spiritual lives that concerns Paul. Furthermore, Paul was living in a society, at the time he was living in the Roman society, and Roman society was very tolerant of certain kinds of behavior. And another thing he was worried about is Christian communities having their own faith tradition watered down by making too many accommodations to the prevailing culture. We face the same thing today in modern America. Churches worry about that all the time. How do we create a sense of discipleship? How do we live into our Christian ethics in a way that don't get watered down by making accommodations to the prevailing culture? So the other thing Paul is trying to communicate to people is that Christians need to be different, right? And so he lists out ways in which he wants Christians to distinguish themselves. Again, that's his context. That was the context in which he lived, and those were the things that he felt were important. In our context, in our day, in our time, if two consenting adults come together and wish to get married in the church, to commit to one another, to make vows towards one another, that relationship is holy. And there's nothing about the culture that would necessarily suggest that what they're committing to is something that the culture is trying to get them to do. The culture may be much more permissive than what we expect from people who are married in the church. They make a lifelong commitment to one another. Sometimes, for circumstances that are outside of their control, they can't make the relationship work. And if that happens, we always approach that with compassion and with kindness. But our hope is that marriages are all going to be lifelong commitments. Our hope is that those marriages are going to work. And if the culture is making it easier for people to pull apart, we as the church want to make sure that people give themselves every opportunity to be together. And that has nothing to do whether you're of one gender or another gender, whether you're same sex or opposite sex. The beauty and the sacredness of that relationship is something that the church upholds. And I believe Paul also would have understood that. I believe Paul would have also understood that what we're trying to do in the church is create sacred relationships that we stand behind and that we support, and that we try very, very hard to make sure that those relationships can be successful. So for all of these reasons, I don't feel as a minister, as a pastor, and as a priest that there's anything that you can point to in the biblical text or in the way that the biblical text has been handed down to us that singles out in any way same-sex sexual activity as a sin. I do not believe that you can necessarily go there and make that claim without having to explain a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think that, as I've tried to describe in this video, there's plenty of reasons to contextualize those few passages where it's even talked about and to see those as something that occurred in a specific place and at a specific time that don't apply to our context anymore. So when this person writes me an email saying that they've never seen a version of the Bible in which same-sex is accepted, I would say that's just simply a mistake. That there are plenty of ways that you can read passages in the Bible such that same-sex couples, same-sex unions can be seen not only to be loving and deserving of the church's support, but also being considered sacred in God's eyes. I believe that with my whole being. And I'm not the only one who believes that. We have bishops that believe that. We have excellent scholars that believe it. We have people who have spent their entire lives studying the Old and New Testaments in their original languages, and they also believe that. So if you are a Christian, or if you are somebody who is a friend with a Christian, and you want to have a way of addressing concerns that people have about whether or not same-sex sexual behavior is a sin, hopefully this video gives you some information that can help you push back on that. And so that you too can make the case for your LGBTQ+ brothers and sisters. You can make the case for the legitimacy and the beauty of their relationships and the sacredness that those relationships hold in God's eyes. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.